Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video, I thought I would do something a little bit different. And what this one is going to be about is what to look for when you're taking apart a set of heads, on what things you might be worried about or things to be concerned with or things to look for, so that you don't put together something that's going to end up causing you problems later on. So that's the purpose of today's video. So you should get some information that might help you with engine building in general. Now, although these are small block Chevy heads, the same thing pretty much applies to just about any set of heads you buy or get or put on. Doesn't matter the manufacturer, it's going to be this way. These are definitely things to look for. So let's start off with actually what the heads are, why they look the way they do, and we'll go from there. These are actually the AFR Enforcers small block Chevy heads. And if you know anything about these heads, these are Chinese heads. They're machined in China. AFR assembles them. However, these particular set was used for my small block Chevy dyno mule, where I tested a whole bunch of different intake manifolds. They have 133 dyno pulls on them. A lot of run time as far as getting the engine up to temperature so that the test could be the same. So it's got a lot of time on it and all of it with some definite load on them. So it's got some use out of it. Now, they were not assembled from AFR. When you order them, they will be. But what I did is, because the small block Chevy has a solid roller camshaft, and if you get these heads, they're only set up for a hydraulic roller. I myself changed and put on their AFR solid roller setup so that it could run with the solid roller setup of the cam and stuff. So point being is, these aren't exactly from the factory because I did change the springs. As far as anything else, no, it's the same. So one of the first things I look for when I'm looking at the head is, before you do any of the disassembly, I like to see where the burn pattern is. Sometimes this tells you some if it's making power or doing weird stuff. And I want you to look at this. This is the driver's head. And what I'm looking at is, I'm looking at how much of the burn is actually the same for each cylinder. Because sometimes you can have ones that get, especially on a small block Chevy, you can have some that get hotter and maybe there's some stuff missing, especially if you're running nitrous. So if I look at this one, these two definitely look like they've got more of a lighter color through here, while the outside ones are darker. And this could be due to some fuel mixture distribution things. You should also notice, especially around the spark plug area on the deck on each one, because typically when things get hot, from what I have seen, they usually melt somewhere in this area around the spark plug. And you can see some little weird marks there. But this isn't even the strange one. So this is the driver's side head. But I've already taken apart this head. This is the passenger. Now, I'm showing you this to show you how much different it is. See these marks here? They do not exist on the drivers. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a really great answer for this. My thought is this. If you look at it, it's really dark on this cylinder and it gets lighter, less of it as you go throughout. Part of me says that the block itself was decked uneven. In other words, maybe there was a few thousandths taken off more on this side of the block, not the heads, on the block than on this side, so that the head's actually sitting a little bit flatter on there, which meant that the piston on this one, this cylinder here, would be a little bit closer to the head than it would be on down here. And because if you look at it, I'm not saying it made contact or anything, but if you look at it, there's definitely some burn pattern there. And I'd say I'm concerned, but I'm not. It definitely has some washing, which the camera's doing a crappy job of capturing. It did go right there. But it is a bit strange and something to deal with. So if I was going back together, which I am going to put a different set of heads on, I'm going to check the piston in the hole to see how far in the hole or out of the hole this cylinder is compared to this one, and then on the other ones. Now, I didn't assemble the short block. I'm not blaming him either. It may not even be that issue. It may just be that this side, for whatever reason, maybe just a few thousandths lower deck height than this one, which you wouldn't think would be a big deal, but maybe if you just right there on the edge, it would cause that. So, but pay attention to that. The other thing you need to pay attention to is between the cylinders itself. If you see coloration between these, typically what that means is it has burned across and your head gasket's not sealing. On a small block Chevy, typically they're right through here because we have our two exhausts together. But you take a LS, Ford, and those ones, it can vary. It can be on any one of them. Typically, somehow it still ends up being the center ones, even though the exhausts aren't the same. I know it sounds weird. I rarely see where they torch the ends except for some of the LS's just because of their bolt patterns, but on a small block Chevy it's really rare. So pay attention to that first, and that's one of the key things. The next thing I do, and I'm going to show you it, is I vacuum test the head. This is the next way I check out heads. Now this is a vacuum tester that's on my seat and guide machine. Now obviously you probably won't have this, but you can go to Harbor Freight and just get a hand pump vacuum tester. I think they're like 20 bucks. You probably could use it for a bunch of other stuff like bleeding brakes and other things. So not just for this task, but essentially what you do is mine runs on air, but I click it on, I put it on a port. Let's just pick this one, doesn't really matter. And I know how much it's gonna pull max, but it doesn't really matter for what you're doing. But what you're gonna do is pull max and then turn it off. So in your case, see how long. What you're doing is you're looking to see how long or how much time it takes for that to pull down. And as you can see, it's pretty much steady. It hasn't really lost anything, which means it's pretty well sealed. So the reason why we do this test is because we're gonna test all 8 ports. So if I test all the ports, and I've got one that's for whatever reason low, I know to put a mark there to check that out when I'm taking apart the head to take a closer look at that port. Now on these, because even though they got 130 dyno pulls, they're all sealed up, even the intakes. So it means at least they're sealed this way. However, I could tell you this from experience, and I had several people argue with me on this one, and then I did a video showing it. You can have a bent valve where the stem's bent, and you could do a test just like this, vacuum test it, and it will pull vacuum correctly. So it will do just like what it just did. It will show no leakage and the valve's bent. You're like, there's no way that's impossible, it would be kicking off. No, the stem itself will kind of S-curve and it'll seal itself. So this isn't the only test you should ever do, but it does tell you right off if something's really, really bad. But it should not be your only test that you use, because I've had many heads come through that will pass the vacuum test and have a valve that's bent. So anyway, so this is the first thing. So now let's go ahead and start tearing apart the heads, and we'll show you some of that stuff. Okay, here we have start tearing apart the head. And I've got my very expensive valve spring press, and I understand you guys probably don't have that. I'm not trying to brag, I'm just saying this is probably not a piece of equipment you have at home, but eventually you're probably gonna tear apart a head. What I do is I pop off a couple of the locks, and I pulled off 2 just for this demonstration to kind of show you. But one of the things you gotta examine is the actual lock. So these are bead locks, but the thing you wanna look at is the back side. Now these will actually look really, really good. What you're looking for is to see if it's shiny. And what I mean by this is black oxidized coating that are usually on them. But if you see it's shiny, not like perfect metal or ground metal, looks like there's grooves in it, what that's typically meaning is you've got valve float, because what's happening is the retainer itself will spin around that lock. And when it does that, it's wiping off the black oxide coating and it's starting to make a groove. That's indicating your valve floating. The reason why is when the valve comes, it's supposed to sit like this, but when the valve floats, it's coming off and allowing the spring to turn. And if it's turning on that lock and rubbing that. It's a sign of valve float. These do not have a sign, and clearly they're all black. It looks like they're almost new. Now, don't get too paranoid if you don't see some that have, or if you see some that have some discoloration, because even though these are machine locks, there'll be small variances, and we'll get some little mark left in them that's going to happen. It's when they're really heavily glazed, it's definitely a sign of worry. Another thing you can look at to see that is looking at the tip of the valve. See this witness mark that's right across the center, which looks fairly wide, by the way, which is another thing to look for. Let me see if I can find one that's better. There you go. Look at that valve right there. And we get, there we go. You can even see that one. See how wide that is? That means the push rod length probably wasn't the most ideal. But look, one thing, you have one mark going across. The other sign of valve floats when you start having this mark, but you'll have several marks. So you have one maybe here, another mark across here, another mark across here, like a star pattern. Typically that means you're starting to go into valve float, and the reason why that happens is the same reason that valve's rotating, and that causes that to happen. So it's just one of those things to look out for. However, in the course of running long periods of time, these are going to go away, because eventually your valves are going to move anyway, because if the guides are honed, just like a piston ring will actually turn around a piston as it's going up and down, eventually over long periods of time, this moves. This way you can take apart a stock one and it looks like, it looks pretty you won't even see these marks because the valve's kind of moved. But when you start seeing stars and it's got a little runtime on it, it's a sign. The biggest sign for me is locks. But that's another one just to kind of help you look at. So if you got multiple ones, you definitely need to check into it. Now, the next thing I'll do is after I've gotten these off, one of the things to do is I want to push the valve through and it should slide out. So I shouldn't have to pound it out. It should be able to slide back through the guide. I want it to slide. If you have any hiccups or it's holding up in here at all when you're pulling the valve through the guide, you've got something that's worrisome. Another thing that can happen is, even though these are bead, man, I hate this camera. Even though these are bead locks, so you got a bead groove on the valve, sometimes you can have a little burr that occurs right here at this lock because of the pressure on the lock and on the valve, and that burr will prevent the valve from sliding through the guide. So in other words, you'll end up pushing it, which I'm probably gonna shove it out too far, and you'll get, say here, and it will get stuck. Don't try shoving it through, you're just gonna scratch the guide. Take a small file, knock off your burr, then you can slide it through. But what you wanna do is feel it coming through and sliding. So I can go back and forth and it's great. And then take it out in the order. So in this valve, I've taken it out. You're like, what is that on it? See that right there? That's actually silicone from what we use and it's actually attached to the valve. We use silicone to seal the headers to the head. And you're like, why didn't you use gaskets? Silicone works fine, but that's what that is. But what you want to do now is you want to look at the valve, and you're looking to see, this is the seat part, you're looking to see if there's burn areas where it's shiny and then there's just a dark spot, because that means it's actually got a leak. Some exhaust gases have gotten through and you've got a problem. And these look fairly shiny all the way around. Now look, there's some pits there, which the camera probably won't do a good job of showing because it's an iPhone piece of shit. But there's some pits there. Sometimes that happens from carbon building up and getting away the valve. So that's a sign. It's not horrible, but look for the pitting. Pitting usually happens if a lot of carbon builds up there and it makes that little piece and then just kind of eats through the valve. The other thing to look for is the stems. You could tell like where the exhaust gases tried coming up a little bit, and you could see that. But what you don't want to see is you want to examine the stem and see if there's any spot on the stem itself where it looks like it's really shiny, and that's because it's been grinding on the stem. And that's a sign that it's about to stick itself. And when a valve sticks in a guide, it will, the piston will hit the valve, it'll break the valve head off, and you've tore up your whole motor. So you definitely want to examine for that. These look pretty well. Around the bottom here, you got a little bit here. That's nothing really to worry about, but that's something, kind of the stuff that happens typically through here. But when you got one that looks like it's definitely golding, you've got issues. So there's what to examine on that. Now I'm going to take apart the whole head and I'll show you the rest of it. One more thing I forgot to show you. I also checked the valve spring installed height. Now, you may not be able to do this, but I took notes on this head when I assembled it, so I know exactly the installed height that I had before. So I'm checking it again. And the reason for this, and it's a very important thing if you've set up your heads first. If you weren't the one that put the set heads together and didn't take notes on it, this would be completely worthless to you. And I'll show you another way you could do it. Is I checked the installed height to see if it grew. And the reason for that is because sometimes valves, I'm gonna grab the valve again. This valve itself can do something called tuliping, and I've showed on a previous video what it looks like. But essentially what's happening is this part, the spring's pushing up, and this part that gets weak and actually stretches the metal, and it will actually grow, and it will tulip the valve and make it look exactly like this, but worse, even on intake valves. So the way to check for that is you could check with your installed height to see if it was just like what it was. And by the way, it's exactly 1.88, which is the same thing what it was when it was installed. But if you're like, I don't have an ability to do that, I don't know what it was checked with before, what you can do is you can get a straight edge and you can lay them across the valves. Now, I'll warn you this is important too. Not all the time, even me, I don't have the intake and exhaust valve stems heights the exact same. So they might be variants of 10 or 15 thousandths. But what you want to compare is the two intake valves. So if the two intake valves are the same, you're good. If two exhaust valves are the same, you're good. Ideally, we'd like to have them all the same height, but that doesn't happen. And someone's like, you're a moron, you don't know what you're doing. Well, the reason why is because exhaust valves typically have more margin than an intake valve. So because of that, they either sit lower or higher, depending on how you've done it, than the intake valve. So they won't be the same stem height necessarily. They'll be close to like 10 or 15 thousandths. And you're like, oh my gosh, that throws off your whole rocket arm geometry. No, it doesn't. You're fine. You could be further off than that. But anyway, just check to make sure both intakes are the same and all the exhausts are the same. That's the way you can do it, or just valve spring mic. And if you've got a valve spring mic, you can just do it that way without a straight edge. Just take them all off and check to see what the installed height's on all of them. The intakes should all be about the same, and the exhaust should be the same. You might do it without shims on it though, just to be safe. Make sure that the shims isn't slightly off. So there's something else just to check. Here's a pro tip for you too to taking off these. Sometimes what will happen is, and this is my valve spring compressor, and you can have a manual one, you'll find that the locks doesn't want to come out. So I'm gonna press and you'll see what I mean. It didn't move. That didn't collapse, the locks didn't pop off. So here's a tip. Don't keep trying to fight so hard or using your pneumatic one. What you can do is you take a hammer, it doesn't have to be a big one, and you can just lightly tap on, I use my tap on the tool, not actually on it. And for those that think you're damaging, no, that's incorrect. You just lightly tap it and it's gonna free up the retainer and lock. See how it just moved? That's all you have to do. You do not have to Thor hammer it. Just a light tap and it breaks it free. It makes life so much easier, because if you keep trying to force it this way, it's trying to bow the valve, and the spring compressor takes a workout. So all you do is put a little pressure, light tap, those are broke free and it'll come right out. Same thing if you have a manual one. One of the other things to check is how loose the guides are. Now, I'll be honest with you, unless you have machine parts like myself, this might be somewhat subjective, but what you do is you just simply put the valve in the guide and see how much wiggle there is. I'll warn you, the smaller the stem valves, it seems like you're moving a long ways, like they're really, really loose, when in fact they're probably tighter than what you think. On the bigger stem valves, say for instance, since this is 8 millimeters, say for instance 11/32, those ones, they don't seem like they move as much, but the smaller the stem, the more movement it feels like it has. So it is kind of a, if you're not into this and don't do it very often, it'll feel much looser than what it is. So even like these seem loose, but they're really not. And the way I check them is I will take them after they're all cleaned up and stuff. I'll go over to the seat and guide machine, and I actually have pilots that are sized for every half a thousandths. And if one goes all the way through, then I know, well, they go to the next size bigger, and I can figure out which one it stops at, that I could tell how much actual clearance there is in the guide. The thing though that can happen too is it's not always straightforward as that. Like you can have it be larger at one end and smaller at the other end. In other words, they're almost banana shaped. So in other words, the guide's kind of like sloped in it. So it's wore out one end, but not in the other one. And the middle is kind of high. That's from bad rocker arm geometry. It tears up the guides and it makes the guide clearance look loose. So that you could have a probe that goes in there and it says, look, it's tight there, but it's loose on the other two ends. That's something you probably can't do at home. So in other words, just wiggle and give it a test. Now, the last thing I'm gonna leave you with on this deal is how to do the deck thing. First off, you can't tell how uneven the deck is unless you kind of wash it, because this carbon's gonna mess you up. And here's what I mean. What you're gonna do is you could take a straight edge like this, and you put it across the deck like so. And I can't hardly do it like this. And you're gonna take your feeler gauge, move my hand here, which I can't do this with one hand, but you're gonna take your feeler gauge and shove it underneath there, and under each part where it touching the head, like right in between those, and that way. And then you would also go like so, and do it across this way, and then across this way, and you kind of get the idea. Doing it like this in multiple directions, you'll start seeing high and low spots, and you'll be able to measure them. And like I said, make sure you get a machine edge. You can't just use something that you think's perfectly flat. You can't. Like this deal here cost me like $100, but it's definitely a machine surface perfectly flat. You can't get something you think's flat. In other words, if I use this end, which is not machined, it's not the same. So that's a way that we check the deck surfaces and tell if they're really, really bad. And if I can get a 6/1000 in, there's no if about it. You should definitely mill, but usually at 3, I highly recommend it, and most people do it anyway. But like I said, most heads that get run, they already need milled. It's just the way it is. Anyway, and I'm not talking like, oh, I'm gonna take off 30/1000. Usually it takes between 3 and 6/1000 on a head that's pretty normal to clean up. Matter of fact, you can have new heads, and I've shown videos on this, where brand new out of the box, never been bolted on the engine, and they'll be unflat by 6 to 9/1000. I've had that happen before, and you're like, nah. In other words, it's fine here and it's fine here. It's dipped in the center, or in a weird pattern because of the way they heated up the head to pound in the guides or seats. So anyway, there's that. Okay, now that the head is disassembled, here's what I look for. The shiny part you see here is the seat. What I'm looking to see is that this thing's shiny all the way around. Because yeah, it passed vacuum tests, but it can, like I said, the things can be bent and still seal. So what I'm looking for is to make sure this is shiny all the way around. And it looks like it's not there, but here's the thing to remember on the camera, if it's shiny, it reflects the color that's around it. So in this case, because there's black carbon, it looks like it's reflecting black carbon, because when I shine the light on it, which I'm gonna try to do, but I don't know how well the camera's gonna capture this. Yeah, there you go. It's just transferring what's there. It's shiny the whole way. It just, all it's doing is reflecting. So they actually look good, even though the camera's gonna make it look probably bad. One thing I did notice is there is a little bit of rust here, and you can see where the black is creeping up on this one. That's where the carbon's coming up, so it's not quite as sealed. Yeah, it's still sealed there at the top, so it passes the vacuum. But as you can tell in the lower part of the seat, it's not. And it looks like we've got a little bit of, that's silicone, by the way. Yeah. There's a little bit of rust right through here. And you could definitely probably see it on this side too. This is the only one that really has it. This can happen because if you shut the engine off and the engine's hot, then you got humid air. Sometimes you can have condensation build up from the whole thing. It just happens because this head will cool off faster than some of the other pieces. So then the water will condense against it. So that's probably what's happened there. There was never water in the engine as far as like in the ports or anything like that. Sometimes though, when you pull off the head, if you got a valve that's open and you open it up, the water can get where the valve was open depending on how you pulled it off. So it's not the end of the world to have rust, but you definitely don't want rust on the seats when you're putting it back together for it to seal. It's just not ideal. This is just surface rust, so it's not bad, but if you can scratch it off, you need a valve job. So anyway, that's what I've looked for. And at this point, it looks pretty good. Everything looks fine. You can lay a flat edge across the deck and check to make sure it's you know, not warped in any way. But I could tell you from any head that's been ran. And you're like, you're just saying it because you have a mill. No, I'm saying it because I've milled so many heads. I can tell you, if you run a head, it needs surfaced again. I can already tell you, like, even though it's perfectly sealed and there's no witness marks here, but if I put a flat edge here or if I put it on the mill, this one especially is probably down 3/1000. Now, will that cause it not to seal? Probably not. Probably run just fine on a regular engine. But let's say you're putting some heavy boost to it. And I'm not even talking about this. You could do an LS, any make an engine, and you're putting heavy boost to it, and it might have still perfectly naturally aspirated. Then you add just a little bit more. It no longer has enough room because that 3/1000 made the gasket allow it to lift, and you've blown a head gasket, which may have never occurred naturally aspirated. Then if you'd milled it down, got it perfectly flat, maybe you could have gone to 30 pounds of boost before it decided to lift the head in the center or something. So no, it's not the end of the world to have it like that. Usually at 6,000, I tell people, you know, it really should be done anyway, but regardless. But 3,000s you can get away with, but I prefer, of course, obviously flat. So anyway, that's pretty much it as far as the checking things that I mainly do, besides one more thing, and that's this. I will check all the spring pressures. So what I've done already, I'm going to save you some video time of watching, is I had, because I'd assembled the head, I had the spring pressures from what they were before on all these springs. Do I usually do that for most customers? No, I just did this one because it's for the dyno mule. But if you don't, you can look up to see what the spring should be stock, and then you could test it to see if it's still good. So for instance, I tested all these on the even side, and I've got all their pressures. This is the seat, so I mean, like the seat pressure and open pressure. And actually, they're within about 2 pounds of what they were when they were brand new assembled. And that's after 133 dyno pulls and a whole bunch of other stuff. So they're fine, and that's how I check them. But I've got a very expensive valve spring compressor checker, or spring tester to check with. If you don't have this, which I wouldn't blame you if you did, if you're just a regular hobby guy, you can go to some machine shop and they'll probably charge you a little bit, but they could check your springs for you. So it beats putting these back together thinking you got everything right and the springs are weak. And by the way, it's not one of the biggest misconceptions. You think all the springs go weak at the same time. Incorrect. I don't know how many times where it's like the last spring I checked, so I got 16 springs, I get to number 16 and it's down 25 pounds from the rest. You're like, well, just shim it up. If it's down 25 pounds, it means it's not good. It needs change. And what are you gonna do? Just change one spring? I mean, you can if you're just desperate, but you end up changing them all. So there's some information for you. Hopefully you got something out of this video. Guys, remember, I'm no Superman. You guys take care.